And let's introduce our guests this morning. First, we'd like to bring in Dr. Mark Esper, the former U.S. Secretary of Defense, the 27th of his time, his first visit to the Global Cybersecurity Forum annual meeting. Please, Mark. Sir Jeremy Fleming, the former director of the GCHQ in the UK. So Jeremy, nice to have you for the first time. Thank you. And President José Manuel Barroso, the former president of the European Commission and also the former Prime Minister of Portugal. Thanks very much. Good. That was quite an opening ceremony. It's covered all the progress for the two newbies, if you will, here at the GCF. But it's been a very busy GCF Institute now that it's been formalized. Before we get started, it's an extraordinary number, and we talked about the partnerships being established. When I first came 3 years ago, we looked at the damage of cyber threats to the global economy. And even though the data wasn't complete, and that's why you have the partnerships that are being established, for example, the World Economic Forum, the damage then was estimated at $2.3 trillion. And now in 2025, that number is expected to grow to $10.5 trillion in short order. The latest peg on the global GDP puts us about $110 trillion. We're looking at about 8 to 9% of GDP being affected from cybercrime right now. And we're living in an extremely complex world, I think it's fair to say, Mark. How would you say we can de-escalate some of the tensions that we see in cyberspace itself? Because it's become a new frontier, new technologies, AI is around the corner as well, which will intensify the rollout of technologies, and then quantum computing. How do we get to a framework of global collaboration concretely, not kind of a chat room, of how we can de-escalate in that space?
Yeah, look, it's a great question. And first of all, I want to say thank you to our hosts for inviting me here today to this very important conference. And I would be remiss if I didn't congratulate you on the breadth of what GCF is doing. The initiatives on protecting children is extremely important. So thank you for doing that and for promoting women in STEM. As a father of a daughter who's an engineer, it's important to me as well personally. So thank you for that. Look, de-escalation, how do you get to that path? I think you have to pursue multiple approaches. Of course, in a perfect world, John, what we would do is we'd have all the nations of the world agree. We'd come up with rules and norms that would evolve into laws and regulations. We would agree on intelligence sharing. We would agree on reporting. And we would agree on collective law enforcement action. But we're not there yet. There are many countries that do participate in that type of regime. We have a lot more work to do, but not there yet. So I think in the meantime, the second path we have to pursue is that we have to work among like-minded nations, countries who agree with things like protecting children, protecting our economic prosperity and growth, protecting national security. And the United States, of course, does that through organizations such as ASEAN, I think ECOWAS, and others. So I think that's another path forward. I think there are also collaborations that need to happen between governments and businesses and other stakeholders that are very important, because as we respond to what's happening out there, we need to do so coherently. I'm an advisor for a global legal and public policy firm called Squire Patton Boggs. What they see out there is, as nations continue to address what's happening in cyberspace, not just at the national security level, but economic attacks, ransomware attacks, things like that, what you see is increasing market fragmentation that makes it harder for businesses to navigate the international global environment. So we have to address those challenges too. And then lastly, I would be remiss as a former Secretary of Defense about mentioning the military aspect of that. I think as nation states see a challenging path forward on collective action, I think what you'll see are more and more countries taking individual action, because at the end of the day, you have to make it costly. There has to be a price for bad actors in the international environment for doing what they're doing, whether it's ransomware, espionage, intellectual property theft, or just causing turmoil within countries or within elections. There has to be a price to be paid. So until we get to that global regime of norms and accepted behaviors that everybody buys into, we have to put a price. We have to make it costly for bad actors trying to act in this international environment.
Good. I think it was particularly prescient by the organization to have somebody from the military background and actual practice, the intelligence community with you, good sir, and then policy and leadership, not only in your home country of Portugal, but also at the European Union. So I want to tap that sort of knowledge base. So having these things, Sir Jeremy, coming from intelligence, Mark addressed the defense structures here and the hopes for de-escalation. What do you see when you have sometimes irreconcilable differences between countries at one level, the geopolitical level, where you can have collaboration when it comes to the cyberspace? Is that possible?
Certainly it's possible. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be back in Riyadh, and thank you for this. Welcome to this amazing forum. It's my first experience.
Yeah, welcome.
So I wish I'd come before. I mean, it is clear that the dividing lines between states nowadays, between those that are acting responsibly and those who are choosing not to act in that way. And those states who are acting responsibly are taking this agenda very seriously. They're focusing on the health of their digital homelands. They are taking part constructively in the sorts of dialogues we're trying to have today, trying to establish new norms and legislation. But they're also reserving the ability to act in extremis, to protect their interests in accordance with international law. And that framework for responsible cyber action, I think that's gaining more traction. You're seeing it. But of course, there are those who are choosing not to act that way. And you see that in intelligence. You see that playing out in geopolitics. Frankly, you see it playing out in your daily life. If you're a citizen more or less anywhere in the world at the moment, the crime you're most likely to face is a cybercrime. So the impact of action in cyberspace is not just something which is restricted to the secret world, that if you like my former world, it's not something that is just playing out at a state-to-state level. It's happening at a private sector level, at a community level, and at an individual level. So I mean, so your question is there, are there means here to de-escalate?
Yes.
And of course, there are, and there have to be. And to pick up Mark's point, this is about making sure that we have like-minded countries who are coming together to make sure that the responsible side of the conversation wins the day. What we are having trouble with doing is making sure that there are consequences for being a irresponsible actor. Mm. And some of those are obviously in the secret space. Sometimes they can be in the military space. But mostly they need to be around the way in which the international order operates in cyberspace nowadays. And we have to do a better job, I think, at working out where the consequences are for cyber escalation.
Great. I think our audience might have forgotten, President Barroso, that the European Union received the Peace Prize in 2012. And I bring it up because you accepted that award on behalf of the European Union. And I bring it up now because we're living through a period of rapid, intense complexity, right, on technology, but also conflict, right? We've had a war grinding on for 3 years between Russia and Ukraine, uncertainty in the region. So I wanted you to share, if you can, sorry to elevate this to the level of wisdom, but share some wisdom on the pathway for de-escalation, and to make sure, this becomes a pretty nasty playing ground if you don't get it right. What do you see are the pathways to peace, if you will? And that includes the cyber world, which affects everybody in the North and the South.
Thank you, John, for your kind words. Your Royal Highness, Your Excellencies, dear friends. First of all, let me say it's indeed a great pleasure to be back to Saudi. I was here last year, and every year I come, I see difference. It's amazing. I want to congratulate our Saudi hosts. We see that it's one of the most exciting places to be in terms of economic development and also on societal change. It's really amazing, and it's really feel great to be here in this very important global cybersecurity forum. About your points, you said I should use my wisdom, but I should also, I think, use my honesty, intellectual honesty. And we are not in a good moment nowadays. And it's difficult to separate cybersecurity from the global political landscape that is becoming increasingly difficult. Just recently, the Munich Security Conference highlighted cybersecurity threats as the second biggest risk to the states after climate change. I will not discuss the order, but in fact, Since last year, as you said, John, the cyber crime has increased. And if we are intellectually honest, we have to be prepared for that. It will increase. In spite of the great efforts of fora like this one and other efforts, the cyber crime will increase because there are malign actors, both politically and economically. And some of the technologies, including AI, generative AI, and others, in fact, make the digital space even more difficult to manage. It's true that, according to some experts, some of those innovations can also help us fight cyber crime. It's true. But the reality is that the digital space is becoming increasingly difficult to manage from a security point of view for states, for companies, for corporate world. And this is why we should welcome all efforts to prepare. So my first word is, let's prepare. Preparedness is the key. At national level, at the regional level, in European Union, we are doing something. We have a European Agency for Cybersecurity. I believe it's not sufficient, but we are doing a lot. And also between like-minded partners. Let's prepare. Let's make exercises. The reality is that since the beginning of this decade, we already had the biggest pandemic in 1 century. We have the first war in Europe after the Second World War, a very serious and dramatic war. I don't need to tell you how difficult the situation is also in this region, in the wider Middle East. And also we had the biggest record in terms of hot here, so the temperature since there are weather records. So we are in a difficult moment, and we should not pretend we are not. But what we can do, and that's why this initiative is so important, is to mitigate the risks. There are some areas where I believe international cooperation can be relatively sincere. One of them is child protection, and I really welcome what you've said, because I don't see any reason why the governments, in spite of geopolitical interests and differences, should not consider child protection a global public good. And we may be from the left or the right, from the north or the south, and we should agree on standards and rules universally accepted to child protection. On other matters, to be frank, I think it's more difficult. So my message is very simple. If you want to be intellectually honest, competition is unavoidable between states. Cooperation is indispensable.
Very interesting. You know, I thought it was very telling, all three of you, and I'll open it up to the floor, that His Royal Highness Mohammed bin Salman thought it was important to put out a statement on the role of cybersecurity in today's economy, right? And then this GCF evolving into an institute in the last year. How do we make sure that we can de-escalate the tensions that the President brought up to make sure that cyber doesn't fall off the agenda? The agenda's full. We came out of COVID-19, record spending, high inflation, supply chains were bottled up, climate change to deal with, all the things that President Barroso mentioned. How do you make it a priority? The business community, as you saw at the MSC, and the security community said 2. World Economic Forum had it as the number 4 risk this year and next year. How do you keep it right at the top, in your view, Mark? And you've been in government. So Jeremy, you've done the same. I'd love to hear, how do you make space for it, vital space?
Well, first of all, when I saw the Crown Prince's statement, I read it twice because I thought it was a very good statement. It covered the breadth of what we're dealing with, from national security to economic prosperity, all the way through the safety of our people and our society. So it does cover the breadth of what we are addressing here. I think in many ways we don't have to work hard to keep it at the top of the list because of the nature of cybersecurity. You look at the threats. First of all, in the cyberspace, it's an asymmetric tool that rich countries, poor countries, strong countries, weak countries, organizations or people or even governments can use that tool against others to gain an advantage or to level the playing field. And of course, we see that in the United States. We see that in the United States military. So number one, it's a tool that's an equalizer. Number two, you cited the facts up front, John. You see these incredible growths when it comes to monies expended, revenues, GDP growth in the cyberspace, in the digital economy. That's going to continue to get a lot of attention. And complementing that is the fact I mentioned earlier that as businesses try to navigate more and more the digital economy, they're going to need more consistency, more predictability. they cannot afford patchworks of regulatory law or privacy and data sharing, things like that. So we're going to need to smooth that electronic environment. And I think the third thing that we'll probably touch on that is very important too is the cyberspace is not static, it's dynamic. So as you see increasing advances in artificial intelligence, in quantum sciences, in advanced logarithms and software, it's going to make this offense-defense component all the more challenging out there. So cyber is not going away anytime soon. It's affecting, as Manuel said, north, south, left, right, adults and children. And that's why, again, I applaud, we should all agree on the importance of protecting our children in this digital environment.
Okay, thanks for that, Mark. So Jeremy, I don't want to compromise you, of course, with your intelligence knowledge in front of a crowd of 1,000 people in the room here, but give us an insight of how you ensure from what you saw in the intelligence coming into the UK, that this doesn't slide off the agenda, that you can convince lawmakers, despite election cycles, this has to be, as Mark was saying, continuous policy and embedded in the system, that it's always changing, by the way, because it's changing so fast.
So thank you, John. I'm going to make 2 points that pick up from where Mark left off with a little of the secret stuff, actually. Because, I think the reality is nowadays that what is happening in cyberspace is out there in the open. Big technology companies have as good a radar on what's happening in cyberspace as governments do. And so that leads to two conclusions for me. The first is that there is no point in governments talking to each other about cyberspace. This has to be a genuine partnership with the private sector, because the private sector have many of the levers we need to make sure that this technology is safe, to make sure that threats are called out. Now, there is a space in all of that for secret stuff. There's a space for the things that only governments can do. But again, that has to be in tandem with the private sector. And the second thought is that I've spent the last 15 years thinking and talking about cyber. But if you ask me to give you a crisp definition of it, I'm still struggling. And so I think we have a communication problem here in how we talk about cyber and how we engage our populations in making sure that it stays at the top of the agenda. And to my mind, the debate we're having at the moment about artificial intelligence, and particularly safety, is a way into this. If we're thinking about making our children safe, then that's a cyberspace issue. If we're thinking about making our economies safe, then that is a cyber security issue. So increasingly, I think the dialogue needs to go down this route, which is to partnership, effective partnership, and using safety as a leader, as a lever to try and create those coalitions of responsible actors to make a difference.
Okay, I'm going to plant something, but I have another question for President Barroso. The idea there's cyber opportunity, to your point, Sir Jeremy, so give it some thought. Mark, the same thing, that we may grade economies and governments in the future on the robustness of their system. Chew on that if you can. And President Barroso, I think it'd be remiss if I didn't also bring another role that you serve, and that is chairman of the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations. I don't think this is a big stretch in the context I bring it up, but during COVID-19, it was almost every country for themselves. Not all players acted that way, but first and foremost, you had to protect your domestic population, right, to make sure they got vaccines. But because I was the emerging markets editor for CNN, I could see in the global south, if you will, the developing world more accurately, they were left behind in many respects, even on financing by getting vaccines. And I want to make sure it doesn't happen in the cyber arena. And it's important that these multilateral institutions have it as a priority to make sure they have the funding to be able to do what we're talking about.
Yeah, thank you, John. I think it's interesting because it's not obvious, but in fact there are some things in common between fighting virus, COVID-19 virus, and fighting cybercrime. And the first lesson is the following. Our countries were not prepared. When the virus of COVID-19 appeared, even the most sophisticated, the richest, the powerful countries in the world were not prepared. And we suffered the consequences in human loss, but in lives lost, but also economically, of that disruption. So that's why I come back to my first point. Let's prepare this time. Let's prepare. Prepare at national, regional, if possible, at global level. That's the first point. The second issue is we should aim, I think, that in spite of this more polarized, fragmented geopolitical world we have now, that the big powers, and also the others, recognize that there are some global public goods, in spite of our ideological differences and political motivations. I think global public health is a global public good. You may be American, Chinese, European, African, Latin American, Middle East. We recognize that a virus does not need a visa to travel, and they don't respect the borders. So it's a global public good. The same applies to climate change, for instance, and others. But to be honest, and if I may say the point, I was, as you mentioned, more than 30 years in politics, but I'm no longer in politics. Since I left politics, my level of sincerity is increasing day by day. I'm giving you my independent opinion, not representing any.
You can be an honest broker now, right? You don't have to worry about getting
it's an
re-elected.
honest opinion. It's independent. I'm not representing here the European Union or any other entity. But to be honest, today multilateralism is in a very bad shape. The United Nations Security Council is blocked. The WTO is not operational in spite of, by the way, she was the former chairperson of Gavi now, Dr. Ngozi. She's doing her best, but the WTO is, and there are some partners that believe it's not necessary to work at multilateral level. So I insist that in spite of those risks, or precisely because of those risks, we should have some cooperation, including in the issue of cyber, thematic, as by the way, Jeremy said, for instance, in the financial world that I've been associated with, there are very good things going. Among the group, the financial groups, including cooperating with the authorities. As Jeremy said, public-private partnership is critically important in the field of cybersecurity. The intelligence services cannot do that alone, but also the private sector has to cooperate to some extent. And also like-minded countries, so we can create, hopefully, it should be some kind of global rules, or at least patterns or standards. But for children, I believe it's I believe it's feasible. But for others, the problem, as you also mentioned, and I think Mark Esper as well, today we are seeing a weaponization of economic relations. There has been, one of the problems of cybersecurity is, in fact, what it can happen to supply chains, supply chain disruption. So I'm afraid I'd like to give you much more good news, but we have to be sincere about this. We have to be prepared for, if we meet here next year, to see that problems have gone up and not gone down. So the best way is to prepare and to try to mitigate the risks.
Good. So let's go back to what I suggested before. You had some time to think, Mark. Excellent interventions by President
I was paying close attention to the wisdom.
I know. That's what he's here for. That's why we keep on inviting him back, by the way, as well. This idea that if you have a robust system, you know, there's so much based on trust, in whether it's the British pound, the US dollar, the euro, the yen, renminbi, it's all about trust. So this trust in the cyber security systems in a country, it becomes a kind of a badge of honor, if you will, on the checklist for foreign investment. Are they robust? Do they protect me? What do you think?
Yeah, look, I think that's where it's important that we try and reach for some type of common standards, international standards, a common regulatory framework. What are the rules with regard to protecting privacy and safety? And there are different ways to do that. I agree, I'm kind of not optimistic when it comes to a UN approach, because there are many countries who are not on board with those norms and behaviors. You have some countries don't have the capability to really understand cyberspace. Others are content disavowing the people within their country who are doing it. And some countries are promoting or sponsoring that type of transnational criminal activity. So I think we should look at different fora to do that. I think forums like this one are very important to do that. I think there are informal approaches that we can take to come up with those common standards. You can look at UN entities like the WTO, the World Trade Organization, where you could put some type of cyber practices and rules into agreements. We saw that, I think, in the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Accord of a few years ago. But it is very challenging, and it's difficult, again, if you're trying to operate within this economic framework, because you have this patchwork of rules and laws. And I'll tell you, for the business community, it's challenging as well. I've served on boards and in companies. One company I served on the board of put a lot of effort into making sure that first they were hardened, and secondly, they had resilience in case there was some type of ransomware attack. Because you want to continue to provide services to your clients and customers, and you want to make sure that there is trust that you can do what you do. And then when the government comes in and says, well, we want you to share attack data, you applaud that, but you don't want to share your own vulnerabilities. You don't want to share the fact that you were attacked. So there's a dilemma built into this as well that we need to deal with. But again, it's only increasing. We need to get ahead of it. We need to prepare for it. And forums like this are very important to helping that along.
So Jeremy, what are your thoughts on this idea of, the City of London, for example? It's trusted the world over to put money at play here. The European Union, Wall Street, Tokyo. I mean, you kind of rely on the robustness of an economy. How does cyber fit into that equation in your view, and linking in the private sector and government?
I really like José Manuel's reference to the health sector and COVID. And to me, what it comes down to is resilience. I mean, of course, prevention, preparation are things there, but resilience as a key way of providing, whether it's the City of London or the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia or a proper license to operate, because there's confidence in the underpinning architecture, infrastructure that enables all of us to operate. So I think there's definitely something there. The conversation around resilience has moved on quite a bit, I think, in recent years. We probably, when this forum started, there was a lot of conversation around regulations and standards, and of course that remains incredibly important. But it needs to be widened out. We need to be talking about education. We need to be talking about inclusion, as Mark said. The workforce is still not nearly inclusive enough, and society and our educational systems are not putting enough focus on cybersecurity. So there are plenty of opportunities here through the lens of resilience for states to focus, but also, I think, for society to play its role alongside states.
Good. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, just one quick add, because you mentioned London, which is a big, obviously, financial hub of the world, and finance is one industry in particular that we're all concerned about. Another one is healthcare and insurance because of our medical records and things like that. I wonder whether, again, technology is going to help us out here, and I'll give a quick personal example. I recently had to send a wire to another institution. To do so, because of the concerns about cyber fraud, I had to go to the bank. I had to sit for 30, 40 minutes. I had to provide multiple forms of ID. Then the money was wired, and then it took 3 or 4 more days for the institution to receive it. And all very prudent steps, but in today's digital economy, who wants to wait a week to move money and go through all that? This is where technologies, I think, like crypto, are going to make that more, much faster, safer, because the immutability of crypto, because the accountability and transparency. I think there are going to be technologies out there that will help us through this as well, in addition to doing those things, that good cyber hygiene that we need to do as well.
Okay, you've raised an interesting point, and I'm sure Sir Jeremy wants to address it, but crypto's pretty slippery space because it's been used in the dark corners of the web, and we're trying to make a more secure system, so it requires a regulatory framework. Yeah. Were you thinking that, Jeremy?
Yeah, so I was going to make 2 points. Firstly, on the crypto point, then, it's where crypto hits the real world that you have the security vulnerabilities. The transactions themselves, they are immutable in the way that you've talked about there, but where it is operating and how it hits the real world is the important issue there, and we've got loads of work to do on that. Sure. But the second thing, and it comes back to a theme I started earlier, which is how do we incentivize designing in security into these sorts of products? I feel for much of my career, I've been playing catch-up on technologies. Whether it's the latest generation of telecommunications, 5G, whether it's where we are now on large language models. And I think there is an opportunity for us now to get ahead of this next generation of technology. We can see them coming down the track. We know where they are. We're starting to have those conversations around AI safety. You'll have seen the Bletchley Declaration. we need to start that conversation now on quantum. And I suspect that that's something from a forward-looking perspective that this forum ought to be getting its head round to.
Okay. I wasn't planning on this. You know, with these speakers, we get a chance to share emails and have phone calls and discuss. This wasn't on the agenda, but I was thinking about it in the context of conflict today. President Barroso and the others can chime in. But you need to be a neutral player to bring different forces together, if you will, to reignite globalization. And it ties back to the statement from His Royal Highness about the importance of cybersecurity. But geographically, does Saudi Arabia play quite a unique role because it's rising as a financial center, right? Diversifying well beyond energy, as you know. That it could reach out east, it can reach out west, it can be inclusive to the developing world, which I know the GCF Institute is very concerned about to make sure they're not left behind. What are your thoughts about carving out a space here for global dialogue, but having a neutral player, if you will, on that platform?
Thank you. So I arrived in Riyadh on Monday at 5 a.m. and at 9 a.m. I started having meetings. I met many corporates here. Yesterday and the day before it. And I was really surprised to see how the leaders of those organizations are aware of this kind of risks. In fact, we are seeing a change in the global economic paradigm. Some time ago, in the phase of hyper-globalization, the word was efficiency. Today, it is resilience. You are not a good CEO, you are not a good CFO, or a good chief risk officer if you don't consider the risk. And if you have to choose between a business that gives you 1 million tomorrow, but is high risk, and one business that gives you probably half, only last next year, I think we should value more the chief risk officer or the CEO who introduces prudence in his or her judgment. We are really in a moment that we are changing. The reality is that the economic relations, trade, investment are becoming increasingly contaminated by national security considerations. And that's all over the world, from China to the United States, including Europe. In Europe, there is now a movement of bringing back the supply chains. And so the corporate world has to adapt to this. It's better to defer sometimes profit, but to have a more resilient system. And that is part of the issue about cybersecurity. Now, for the reasons, I just wanted to give the example because I was in fact speaking namely with the corporates here. I think there is a great awareness. And I think for the reasons you've mentioned, Saudi can be an interesting place, and it is already an exciting place in many economic areas, but because Saudi Arabia keeps speaking with everyone. So, and I think from that's one of the reasons why I'm meeting here today. So yes, I think I see a role for this forum for Saudi, and I hope that there will be global interest in committing for that, let's say, perspective for the so-called common public good.
Good. I had not really the pleasure, I have to say, covering the LA riots, but I remember a statement from Rodney King. He says, "Can't we all get along?" Because it was a meltdown. Well, just to say, you can bring it into this point here, Mark, if you can. But why isn't globalization accepted anymore? He's talked about national interest, but how do we make it multilateralism is embraced? Like there was a digital compact, 193 countries, I think it was, signed on to child protection in cyberspace, for example. They agree on that. But by and large, it's pretty popular, particularly in the developed world, to say, I don't support globalization anymore. Your thoughts, and then pick up where you were thinking too at the same time, Mark. Thanks.
Well, to your specific question, I'll just speak for what I see in the United States. I think the reason why globalization, at least as articulated through free trade agreements, et cetera, and we've seen both political parties in the United States stall when it comes to promoting free trade agreements abroad. I think in the United States what you've seen is a lot of displacement in terms of jobs, job security, industries moving abroad, Immigration is a big issue in the United States, illegal immigration. And so people look at this movement and they say that the middle class is losing out, that we've seen jobs go overseas, or we see or believe that people are coming into the country and taking jobs. And so I think that's a big reason why it's stalled out. They haven't seen the promised benefits of globalization as articulated through free trade agreements and whatnot. What I wanted to comment on was what was brought up a couple times by all of us, and that is national security being maybe the primary concern of folks. And I will tell you, as at least a former Secretary of Defense sitting here, I'm obviously very concerned about national security, but less so than I am about what's happening in cyberspace with regard to social media and things like that. I know the United States military can deal with cyber problems. We have a cyber command, we have cyber units, we have occupational specialties that deal with cyber. We know how to deal with that. It's just a matter of time and resources, et cetera. What really concerns me these days is social turmoil, social influence, interference in our elections right now, things like that we don't have a good handle on. And not all of it is external, a lot of it's internal. But to the degree that you have external actors coming in, using the cyber domain, using cyberspace to try and influence people, to try and stir the social pot, to try and break down your culture, that really concerns me. And that's something we need to really get a handle on. In my country, I think similar problems are going on in Europe. I know how to deal with the national security side. I don't have good answers on the other one because it's also tied up in privacy issues. For the United States, it's tied up in First Amendment issues, so forth and so on. But to me, that's a big challenge, at least for modern democracies.
Okay, good. We have 4.5 minutes, so we just ask for brevity because it's our last comments. Can you have that collective action? You want to use an example in intelligence where you share information. U.S.-China, a military call every single week. How do we restore multilateralism? And do you want to use an intelligence example where it does work, Jeremy?
I think that the intelligence examples give us a clue, but not the answer to the sorts of things that you're talking about here. There are intelligence alliances that have operated effectively for 75 years, and of course, closest to the top of my mind is the Five Eyes Alliance. And sometimes that label is used to cover things way beyond intelligence, but at its heart, it's an intelligence sharing alliance. And it's founded on principles of openness, transparency, respecting each other's laws, exchange of information. It's been very successful. But why I say it's not sufficient for the conversation we have here is clearly that is too small a group of countries in the English-speaking world. And cyberspace does not respect those borders. Cyberspace is a global thing, and we require a global approach to it. Now, could it, and alliances like that, provide the kernel of an idea to work out from? Well, maybe. But I think there's real danger in A, militarizing cyberspace, and B, making it an intelligence issue on its own. It's clearly much broader than that.
Great. There's phenomenal insights this morning. Thank you very much. The final word comes to you, José Manuel. What are your thoughts on this idea? Because you were actually a supporter of a wider European Union, more inclusive European Union. Trade blocs, regional trade blocs. It's pretty slippery territory. How do we reset to make sure that cyber is part of that equation of multilateralism?
Look, in the European Union, we are known and sometimes we are criticized because we put regulation ahead of innovation. And sometimes it's true. For instance, the European Union has already a lot of regulation in terms of Digital Protection Act and so on. And some of the companies complain. The Americans are giving us much more freedom. In Europe, there is a strong commitment to this issue about data privacy. In fact, it was my commission who launched GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. So it's true that we have to find the right balance between regulation and innovation. Ideally, we should have global standards, but for the reasons I mentioned, I think it's going to be difficult. Now, we should never give up. By the way, John, you mentioned that the European Union, and I had the honor to receive on behalf of the European Union Nobel Peace Prize in 2012. Why did we receive the Nobel Peace Prize? Let's not forget that the two most devastating wars in the history of mankind, the two world wars, started in Europe. They were at the beginning European wars, and afterwards it became global wars. But reconciliation was possible. And today, people think it's impossible to have a war between France and Germany or the other European countries. So it was possible because there was true reconciliation. There were visionary leaders. Now, what I'm going to say probably is out a little bit of what I'll say. I think we need visionary leaders to work for peace today. We are missing visionary leaders that put peace as the real goal. And we are seeing a worsening of the relationship, as was mentioned very clearly. For the social media is in fact exacerbating tensions, both within our societies and globally. And of course, I'm for freedom of expression, completely free freedom of expression. But we have to recognize there is a problem. So what is the way to come to that? I think, as we have done in the European Union, after terrible wars, 2 terrible wars, it's better that now the former enemies sit at the same table. So I will conclude by saying, keep talking. Keep talking. Military to military. Americans with China. All of us, keep talking. It's better to keep talking than to keep fighting.
And move quickly with those conversations is what I'd say as well, right? I say that because cyber's moving very quickly, right? It's not sitting still for us. I want to thank you collectively. Mark Esper, it's great to talk to you.
Thanks, John.
Delightful to have you here at the GCF. Same thing, Sir Jeremy. Nice to meet you. Thanks for the collaboration before we got to the stage as well. José Manuel Barroso, always a pleasure. We hope we get a chance to do it again together. Can we give them a nice round of applause, please, for the opening plenary for the Global Cybersecurity Forum Annual Meeting 2024. I want to thank the Deputy Governor of the Riyadh. Your Royal Highness, thanks a lot for attending today. Thanks for your opening comments. Governor Maized, excellent opening remarks as well. Please, you're free to leave for this morning. Thanks a lot for the time and attending. Can we give a nice round of applause to the family?